12 to 26, that's 15 chapters. 10 commandments, that should average a chapter and a half per commandment. The commandment against killing is dealt with in Deuteronomy 19, 20, 21, and 22 parts of. That's 4 chapters. That's 2.5 chapters more than we would anticipate on average. It's the greatest treatment of any of the 10 commandments. It gets more attention than loving the Lord your God or not committing idolatry or adultery. It's very detailed treatment, and a shocking one in some way. The chapters 18, 19, 20, and 21, is that what I said? No, 19, 20, 21, and 22, each deal with a sort of subtopic on the question of killing. You know, thou shalt not kill. What does this mean? Thou shalt not kill human beings only? Is this, were the ancient Israelites Buddhist and Hindu about this thing? Should you translate thou shalt not murder? Are there times when killing is, if not appropriate, maybe required? Self-defense, war, what does it mean? It's very ambiguous. And clearly the ancient Israelite editors who put together Deuteronomy recognize that, and so we have a lengthy treatment. Chapter 19 deals with sort of a positive statement of thou shalt not kill. Chapter 19 lists a series of situations which I would characterize as injunctions to protect innocent life. So not killing is one thing. Take it a step further, and this is typical of Deuteronomy, if the idea is that life is important, and that's what not killing emphasizes, then to come down to the end of the day and say, well, I didn't kill anybody today, is maybe not fulfilling the spirit of the law. Maybe taking a positive step and protecting. Let's see what I'm talking about. When the Lord your God exterminates nations whose land he is giving you, and you take their place and so forth, then divide the land into 3 districts and establish, I'm going to paraphrase, establish cities of refuge. And I don't know how familiar you are with this concept, but in ancient Israel, there was, and here we see, by the way, the transition from sort of a tribal society into a more sedentary, I won't say urban because that's not quite right yet, but a settled, less tribal organization. In the tribal days, there was an institution known as the Goel, the kinsman redeemer, or the Avenger redeemer. Your Goel was your nearest male relative, and that person had responsibilities in a number of situations. If, for example, you became impoverished and had to sell your land or yourself into slavery, your Goel, your nearest male relative, had the responsibility, if he could afford it, to redeem you or your land back, to buy it back for you. Right? Another responsibility of the Goel was, you have to think in a time before there would have been judicial institutions, wouldn't have been a sheriff in ancient Israel. Right? And your Goel, your nearest male relative, was responsible for avenging you in case you were murdered or killed. I mean, you have to think there wouldn't be any public officer who would, no prosecuting attorney, no, homicide detectives. Your nearest male relative was responsible for seeing to it that you got justice. Right? But what about, and this is what this law deals with, how do you determine, let me put it another way, is anytime someone kills someone, is that a crime that ought to be punished? How about accidents? And then, in a very modern kind of way, the biblical law raises the question of how would you determine the difference between a murderer and someone who was accidentally instrumental in bringing about someone else's death? And the biblical law comes up with a couple of very modern criteria. Let me read, let's see. I'm reading Deuteronomy 19, verse 4. This is the kind of homicide who may take sanctuary in one of these cities and save his life. The man who strikes another without intent and with no previous enmity between them. Right? So, this is a good one. What is one of the, I'm sure there's a lawyer in this room. One of the elements of the crime of murder is premeditation, intent. You know, you want to, you have to mean it. Well, how do you know, how do you judge? That's looking in someone's heart. How do you know whether someone did something with premeditation? There has to be a behavior or an action which demonstrates it. One test in the Bible is, and with no previous enmity between them. We would call that what in modern terminology? Motive. Yeah. So if you can't determine a motive, for instance, and then it gives an example, the man who goes into a woods with his mate to fell trees, and when cutting a tree, he releases his grip on the axe. That's not a good translation. The axe head comes loose is a better translation. The head glances off the tree, hits the other man, and kills him. There's no indication that there was enmity before. There was no motive. There's no indication that there was any intent in this. The axe head just came off. A little later in the same chapter, verse 11, it goes into another test. When one man is the enemy of another, and he lies in wait for him, attacks him and strikes him with a blow, so that he dies, and then takes sanctuary in one of these cities, the elders of his own city shall send to fetch him, and they shall hand him over to the Goad. Right. So what's that test? Lying in wait. Right. And that's a clear indication of intent. So chapter 19 deals with that in preponderance, but then there's this collection of three little things at the end that at first don't seem to have to do with killing until you look at them more closely. And this, in terms of protecting innocent life. Do not move your neighbor's boundary stone. What would that have to do with killing? Or protecting innocent life?
Conflict.
Huh?
You certainly can have a boundary conflict between neighbors.
Yeah. You can also kill someone by, I mean, in the ancient world, in Israel, if your property shrunk because the other guy was stealing it by chunks, what else was shrinking?
Food.
Well,
Your food. Yeah. You could kill someone by stealing their land. It might be slow. A single witness is the next one. May not give evidence against a man in the matter of any crime or sin which he commits. A charge must be established on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. What does this have to do with killing? What kind of charges would you be bringing against somebody in the ancient world? Let me put it this way. Lying can be killing in this way of thinking, and that becomes explicit in the next law. When a malicious witness comes forward to give false evidence against a man, and the 2 disputants stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges then in office, if after careful examination by the judges he be proved to be a false witness, giving false evidence, you shall treat him as he intended to treat his fellow. In other words, you accuse someone of murder, and it turns out you were a liar in the giving of evidence, then you're guilty of the crime. Boy, if we had a law like that, that would change some things, wouldn't it? Whoa, I think that's. Do you see how almost in a modern sort of legal kind of thinking, this section of Deuteronomy is working through what does it mean? What are we talking about killing here? Well, this section says if the commandment against killing is about life, then we ought to take the positive step and protect innocence, not compound the problem. Right? Don't let the Avenger, for example, kill the homicide. Chapter 20, and this is. Chapter 20 deals with limitations on killing in times of war. And this chapter has causes me and my people in my profession more trouble. Here we go. You ready? I'm going to read a lot of this because I had a discussion with my mother one time. I'm pretty much a pacifist. And she said something about, well, I just wish we did things the way they do in the Bible. I said, I do too. And I whipped out this chapter and read it to her. When you take the field against an enemy and are faced by horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt will be with you. When you're about to join battle, the priest shall come forward and address the army in these words. Hear, O Israel, this day you are joining battle with the enemy. Do not lose heart or be afraid or give way to panic in the face of them, for the Lord. Okay. Then the officers shall address the army in these words. Any man who has built a new house and has not dedicated it shall go back to his house, or he may die in battle and another man dedicate it. Any man who has planted a vineyard and has not begun to use it shall go back home, or he may die in battle and another man, wait, I skipped down, and another man use it. Any man who has pledged himself to take a woman in marriage and has not taken her shall go back home, or he may die in battle and another man marry her. The officers shall further address the army. Any who is afraid and has lost heart shall go back home, or his comrades will be discouraged as he is. Now, do you get what's going on here? What would the army look like if we anybody here bought a new car and not yet driven it? Go back home. Yeah. What is the principle here? It starts out with this chapter it has to do with killing. It starts out with saying, don't disdain your own life so much as to put it at risk when these sort of really life-affirming things are happening. You know, young man, go on home to that bride. You don't need to go out there and get yourself killed.
But that's basically making it a volunteer military, just like we've got.
Well, it does make it a volunteer, but well, just like we offer all sorts of incentives. There's no college payment idea here, and there's no all of those kinds of things. And if you're afraid, any of you who are afraid, go home. If you're not a bunch of liars, then that'd be pretty much everybody. And after you've whittled it down to, somebody said after you've whittled it down to Joshua and Moses, then I want you to pay very careful attention. These are the rules about how to conduct war. Now, understand, this chapter is talking about what we refer to as holy war. And I know Jihad and all of that stuff, that word's a scary word. There's a Hebrew Bible equivalent, and it's also holy war, and it's conducted in the name of God, and that's what we're talking about here. They're God's enemies. When you advance on a city to attack it, make an offer of peace. So what's the first thing in war for ancient Israel? Try to offer peace. If the city accepts the offer and opens its gates to you, then all the people in it shall be put to forced labor and shall serve you. That's not exactly. But they didn't kill them, right? If it does not make peace with you, but offers battle, you shall. And then it goes on. It makes a clear distinction. You can read the chapter for yourself. I won't read it minute by word, but it makes has the clear requirement that the first step is an offer. And only then comes siege warfare and all that sort of stuff. Chapter 20, verse 19. When you are at war and lay siege to a city for a long time in order to take it, do not destroy its trees, for they provide you with food. You shall not cut them down. Someone translate that for me into modern terminology. Do not conduct what kind of warfare? Sure. Please.
How does that reconcile with God's order to, I think, was it Joshua, to go into the land of Canaan and just destroy everybody?
That's what, if you can tell, I'm dreading this topic. It's here it is, and it's important, and I really don't want to talk about it because it's so complicated. If you range the Bible, especially let's say Exodus through 2 Kings, paying particular attention to books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges, right in there around the conflict, you will discover that the Bible does not offer a monolithic picture. There is the notion, and it's sort of a philosophical one, that I'm thinking now of Genesis 15, when Abraham said to God on one occasion, you know, you keep promising to make me the ancestor of a nation, and right now I've got this adopted slave. Right? And God says, I'll take care of that. And then Abraham says, oh, and by the way, I still don't have a land. I don't own any of this yet. And God says, oh yeah, about that. I meant to tell you. What I really meant was not that you're going to have the land, but that your descendants are in about 300 or 400 years. Because God says, Abraham, the iniquity of the Canaanites is not yet mature, ripe, full. So the Bible has this notion, not that God said, I'm going to give Israel a land, let's see, oh, you guys, bad news, I'm picking you. But that all along God intended to accomplish two things in one act. God all along intended to give Israel its land, but he also intended to use Israel as the means for punishing, whatever you want to say, a group of people who were, in the Bible's view, pretty, help me with a word here, sinful. That's a good word. So we tend to think, oh, those poor Canaanites. The Bible didn't think of it that way. The Bible thought of them as deserving of being run out of town. Now, that's one perspective. Then you have the other perspective. If you read how many perspectives are going to be, I'm not sure about 4. Another perspective is that Israel faced its long history of difficulty precisely because it did not do what God had told it to. We read about exterminating, if that's the word you want to use, the Canaanites in some of the early materials. But we also read in Joshua about several groups, individuals and groups, Rahab the prostitute, the Gibeonites later on in Joshua, of Canaanites who made this kind of peace deal that Deuteronomy 20 talks about, right? And in fact, the Gibeonites became officials at the temple. They had jobs in the temple in Jerusalem by virtue of their heritage from then on down through the times of the Chroniclers. So that you have situations, David, one of his wives was the princess of a Canaanite city. Solomon had Canaanite wives. Jezebel was a Canaanite. So we wonder nowadays whether or not this notion of wiping out the Canaanites wasn't more ideological than practical. Everybody understand what I just said? Because to the biblical writers, the Canaanites represented idolaters. And the argument is made in several places in the Bible that if we had just been somehow gotten rid of these Canaanites, they wouldn't have been such a bad influence on us. We would have never done these awful things on our own. We learned how to do this from the Canaanites. Right? But the fact that they could say that in Jeremiah's time and later meant that there were Canaanites around all over, everywhere. Right? So we wonder, A, did they just do a bad job of what God told them to do? Or B, is this way of talking ideological and it never was a real program? Do you hear what I'm saying? Wipe out the Canaanites in that way of thinking would be another way of saying get rid of idolatry, right? And idolaters. And we all know who the biggest idolaters are, those Canaanites. By the way, one of the evidences for this is the book of Judges, and it's famous. If you read Joshua and then Judges in sequence, Joshua seems to talk about the Israelites just conquering the whole place in one fell swoop, right? Or a big campaign. And then Judges begins by saying, oh yeah, we conquered the whole place except for these places. And then we call it the negative list of negative conquest list. You know? And if the place names don't always mean anything to us, but to those of us who know what they were, it would be like saying, oh yeah, Dr. Biddle and his, friends at First Presbyterian conquered all of Virginia in one fell swoop, except for Richmond and Charlottesville and Virginia Beach, that whole Virginia Beach area, and Northern Virginia and Roanoke, and Danville. There are only about 30 places they didn't conquer, right? But if you draw that on a map, you go, huh, that was pretty much everywhere. Especially, I don't know if you know about Israel, the geography there. There are two, there's the central hills that run up the spine, but they are interrupted crossways, east and west, by two large plains, flat places. And that's where all the agriculture is. And that's where all the agriculture was. And that's where all the big cities were. And that's what Israel, according to Judges, did not conquer. Right? So, according to Judges, ancient Israel, when they first came into the Promised Land, sort of were hillbillies. Yeah, that'd be the way to put it. They all live in the hills. And the big city stuff and wealth was going on down in the valley. So, how does it reconcile? It doesn't really. There's no way to homogenize, just to use the example I just set out, there's no way to homogenize Joshua and Judges on this. People have tried. The ancient Israelites, the not so ancient Israelites, not the ones in Joshua's day, but the ones, say, in Jeremiah's day, were embarrassed, some of them anyway, by how Canaanite Israel's behavior was. And you look back on history and you say, well, if we'd have just wiped them out again, we wouldn't have had this trouble. Do you see that way of thinking? Yeah. I want to say one last word in defense, and we're going to go on to chapter 21. I want to say one last word in defense of the ancient Israelite and their so-called, we think of them as being bloodthirsty. We're talking about a time period from the standpoint of Jesus, which was 1,000 years in the past. If we look at our own history, how far back it was the American conquest of the West? We were this bloodthirsty only 150 years ago. So, glass houses and stones and stuff. What impresses me is the impracticality of Deuteronomy 20. It's almost as if you write regulations for war that ensure that you can't fight war. Because you start out by saying, all you people who have something to live for, go home. And all of you who are scared, go home too. Right? And who are you left? Who would you be left with?
People who want to fight.
People who want, yeah, they'd be the people who wanted to fight. Yeah. All right. And don't kill any trees. But I think that's significant. You don't, all right, you're going to have a war, but life has got to go on, people. War is a bad thing. We might have to fight it, but let's not kill the whole, shooting match. Let's not, in addition to killing people, let's not kill the opportunity to live. Right? Which brings us to the next chapter.
One last question.
Yes.
Do these situations which are depicted in Deuteronomy 20
Right.
represent aggression, conquering, as opposed to defense?
Yes, they are. Now, this is in the Bible's way of thinking. We're back to God says, I'm going to give you this land. I'm giving you this one because Genesis 15 suggests God said, okay, where are there some people I need to clean out because of the way they behave? Well, that'd be Canaan. That's what I'm going to give you. And in 300 or 400 years, when the time is right, then the idea was Israel was supposed to run these folks out. They did not. But the idea is they were supposed to. Yeah.
Are the rules for war when the tide is turned and they're coming after you?
No, there are no rules governing defensive war. And this is also another, well, we're on, okay, I see now. That I'm trying to get off this subject. I see now that I'm not going to be able to.
He was trying to get off.
I'd encourage you to read chapters 21 and the first 8 verses in chapter 22 with a view to the notion of how they are interested in protecting and ensuring life. There's a rule in there about when you come upon a bird's nest, you can take one egg, but don't take it all, and don't take the egg and the mother. Right. So the Bible, Deuteronomy, is interested in more than just when it's okay to kill. Deuteronomy is interested in the whole notion of life itself and how important life is. Now, let's get back to Israel's wars. Okay. I want to talk about the holy war concept a little more in detail. This was a religious thing. Not every battle Israel fought was a holy war. These are the characteristics of a holy war, the defining characteristics. One, you're fighting against God's enemy. Okay? It's God's war. Two, it has to be sanctified. It has to be identified as such. And you have to be engaging in that war because God has identified a war to be fought. Right? Some of the hallmarks of that will be the sounding of the shofar, the ram's horn in the right way, the priests dedicating. Do you remember when Saul was fighting the Amalekites and he wanted to go to war, and he had assembled the army of Israel, which was an all-volunteer army, and they were expecting the priest Samuel to come along and do a sacrifice and kick off the whole thing. You remember that? And Samuel didn't come, and Saul offered sacrifice himself, and about the time he was mid-sacrifice, Samuel shows up and says, "What the heck are you doing?" The reason they just didn't raise the army and then just go into the battle is because until the priest sanctified it and all those kinds of things, it wouldn't be a properly constituted holy war, right? And Saul was getting impatient, and so were the people, and he was afraid he was going to lose his army before he could get started, but he couldn't get started until they did it right. So what that means, by the way, all this business about you can go home. Another example, do you remember Gideon and how he fought his battle? He was going to gather the army, and God said, "This is too many." And Gideon more or less did what Deuteronomy 20 said. And he got it down from several tens of thousands to only 300. And he was facing a force about, order of magnitude or two larger than his own. I don't remember the numbers now. So how did they fight the battle? On God's instruction. You all remember that? On God's instruction, they armed themselves, each one, with a lantern, with a candle of some kind in a clay pot, hidden in a clay pot, and a bugle. And they infiltrated in the enemy camp at night, and on a given signal, everyone broke their jar so that the light shined freely and sounded their trumpet. And the enemy was, the Canaanites, were dead asleep, and all of a sudden, there's light all around them, and there are 300 bugles going on. Now, in the ancient world, a bugler implied what? Charge. Well, it also, for one bugler, you would have had, I don't know, a company, a battalion, right? So what Gideon had was 300 buglers. What they thought Gideon had was 300 companies, battalions, whatever would be the right size. So they scared the crap out of them, and they ran away, and the battle was won. And God says in that context, I'm doing all this so that you know you're not winning this fight. Right? Gideon's only the second one to win a battle with a marching band. Joshua did that, first time. We're coming to get you with our drum and bugle corps. You better look out, bud. Right. They've got some mean first trumpets. I mean, Jericho was won because, and the whole point is, read those texts. The whole point is God will say, that's a silly way to win a war, isn't it? And that's we're doing it that way so you know that you didn't win a war. I did. My enemies, my victory, which means what else? It means that what has been conquered, in this case Jericho, or in the larger sense the whole of the land of Israel, belongs to God. You know, remember the story of Achan, who after Jericho had found some stuff and had brought it home and buried it in the tent floor. Do you remember this story at all? Well, Joshua led the people out to battle the next day at Ai, and they got whipped. And Joshua came back home and said, God, I thought you wanted us to do this. Why did we get whipped? And God said, because there's a thief in your midst. Someone has stolen from me. Because what was conquered at Jericho did not belong to Israel. And so they cast lots, and it turned out that Achan had stolen some gold and stuff. And it didn't turn out well for him. But do you get, this is holy war. Now, when David, for example, goes out raiding against the Amalekites, this is not holy war. You can't read anywhere where God said, David, go do that. Nothing about that being God's enemies, nothing about that belonged. That was David being opportunistic. Right? Everybody. So let me put it this way. Every violent thing ancient Israel did was not necessarily sanctioned by God, even in their understanding. And when God was in charge of it, it tended to be ridiculously nonviolent means to win the battle, just to make it clear that Israel's military might was not responsible for their success. None of that to diminish that that was a rough and tough, tumble, ancient world. It was Wild West and then some. And we'll also add that Israel was the little guy on the block. And we can sometimes say, we wish they hadn't been so violent. I would say if they hadn't at least been sort of that violent, they wouldn't be in existence by Jesus' day. Yes. Was that a question?
You said the killing concept was complicated, and so I did a quick search, and yes, it's between 2 Kings, there's up until 2 Kings,
Yeah.
there's 80 verses that relate to it, but I think most of them relate to killing in a sacrificial capacity.
Well,
What I find more interesting is searching for this concept of defend yourself,
yeah.
which shows up 10 times, and it's almost didactically the same. For I will defend the city and save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. In Kings, it's Samuel's. It comes back in Isaiah. Zechariah. For in that day shall Jehovah defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem.
It's always God's always doing it. Another example. This one will be familiar to you, I hope. Where in the time frame is, give me a second to remember mine. The time frame is the 730s BCE, and at that time Israel was divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and the Assyrian Empire was on the rise, and all of the small kingdoms in the area, Moab, Edom, Israel, Judah, were frightened and didn't know what to do. And there were two theories that were popular. One was, if we all banded together and had an alliance, we could stand up to the Assyrians. The other theory was, no, we can't. Well, what you better do is make individual peace as individual nations with Assyria and do the best you can, because they're too strong, even if we all banded together. Well, the people who were in favor of banding together were the northern kingdom of Israel and the nearby kingdom of Damascus, Syria, we would say. Boy, how things, the more things changed, the more they stayed. And they thought, well, we really need a third ally to be strong enough. And so they approached Judah. The king of Judah at the time was Ahaz. The king of Israel was Pekah. And the king of Damascus was a fellow by the name of Raisin. I always think pecan raisin pie, so I can remember. and Ahaz. Now I'm talking about Isaiah chapter 7. And in Isaiah 7, God comes to Isaiah and says, go tell Ahaz not to worry about this at all, that I will take care of it. All he has to do is believe. And so Isaiah goes to Ahaz and says, God's going to protect us, you don't do anything. Well, kings have armies, don't they? That you imagine the uproar in this country if some prophet was to stand up on national TV and advise President Obama and the whole federal government not to do anything about, you pick it, don't ISIS, just don't do anything, just leave it go. God's going to take care of that. That's not how it works. So Ahaz, actually what Ahaz did was tattle on Israel and Syria, tattled to Assyria, and they said, yeah, we'll protect you from that and make you a vassal, and he ended up being taxed and everything he was trying to get out of it. The point is, Isaiah's message from God was, I am the one who protects Israel. Not by might and strength, but by the, you don't do anything. It denies the notion that I am your defender if you do anything. And you found all the texts where God says to various kings, David, all down the line, I'll take care of you, don't worry about it. So, the reputation ancient Israel has for just being that violent, and for God, and of God for being the sanctioner of it, doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Not even in the law in Deuteronomy that governs warfare. It's trying its dead level best to make war, what? Difficult, I would say, difficult to carry out. Yeah. I woke up this morning going, oh, Lord.
The gears are turning.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, what I hear you saying is that it has us, I'll take care of it.
Yes.
But weren't there some preconditions on that taking care of?
Are you talking about with Ahaz?
Yes.
No.
And
No. Ahaz needed to mind, right? Let's read the chapter.
Yeah.
Let me get there. It's
but
big. Go ahead.
And maybe not to him specifically, but all along there's been some preconditions, right?
No.
No? Love you God before you, all the Ten Commandments, all of that sort of stuff. Don't idle.
Okay. Mark that place. I want to go back and just remind us in the context of that question where we started a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to turn to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus 2, verse 23. Years passed, and the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites still groaned in slavery. They cried out, and their appeal for rescue from their slavery rose up to God. He heard their groaning and remembered what? His promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He saw the plight of Israel, and he took heed of it. So, the whole thing, the Bible insists on this. The whole thing, the whole relationship between God and Israel is based in what? Huh?
Covenant.
No. Promise. A promise to Abraham. And what was it? I'm going to protect you. Genesis 12, 1 to 3. Right? Is everybody following me? You know the Genesis 12, 1 to 3 there? Right. And the first requirement placed on anybody in the Bible in this regard, in the lineage of Abraham, is the circumcision requirement in Genesis 17. But the Ten Commandments, the covenant we're talking about, doesn't come along for 300 years. God's relationship with this people is based in promise. And that's Isaiah's message to Ahaz, by the way. It's based in promise, not in covenant keeping. Now, if you want to be God's people successfully and do a good job of being a priesthood of a nation of priests, then the covenant comes into play, structuring that life. But the foundation of that life is and always has been God's promise. Yes. Yes.
Two questions. What's the population at this time?
Which time are we talking about?
The time,
Ahaz, Deuteronomy 20,
Deuteronomy 20.
Deuteronomy 20. I don't know.
Not hordes, but, you know, whatever.
I don't know what I'm going to guess. Well, for one thing, Deuteronomy 20 probably took its written form well after Moses. Remember, we've got the documentary hypothesis, we talked about the sources, all that kind of stuff. So it is taking place, we know, because of Deuteronomy 19 with the cities of refuge, when this transition from a tribal society with Goelim responsible, with Avengers responsible for justice, into a society where they could have cities of refuge and judges. So they've been in the land long enough to begin to make that transition, and so I'm going to guess we're going to be measuring in terms of 1 million or less. 1 million or less, and that's a wild guess.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And that's over all of Israel.
I have
Yes.
a question.
Yes.
This is a question that will test your knowledge as a biblical and military.
Well,
historian.
militarily, I don't know squat. So
The Battle of Jericho was
Mhm.
won as a result of the trumpets and the lights, right?
no lights, just trumpets.
Just trumpets, okay.
Mhm.
Is that the first example, maybe the only example of a successful use of the strategy of shock and awe?
Oh. Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't. The Gideon thing was shocking all. The Jericho thing, the people in Jericho were laughing at us, you know, until the walls fell down. then who's laughing at who now? You know. Other questions? I'm thinking of things that I could say. Yes.
You started off a few minutes ago talking about the prerequisites for holy war.
Right.
Did we finish that?
Yes,
There
yeah,
were
yeah, we
two.
did. I mean, they are. I mean, they are all around the notion that this is God's war. God calls it God's enemy, God's means, right? God's victory, and God's possession.
And can you speak to Muslim holy war then if we're worshiping the same God?
That's where I was going to go.
I just want to check what time it is. I sure. I don't want to go over.
You got 10 minutes for me.
Oh, Lord.
10 more minutes.
In 2 sentences or what?
Muslims wouldn't say this, but a person who studies history, religion as comparative study would describe the Quran as a retelling of the Old Testament, much as the Book of Mormon is a retelling of the Old Bible.
Say that again.
A comparative religionist would describe the Quran as a retelling of the Old Testament. Because holy jihad is, guess what? It's the same thing as, the Hebrew word is cherub. It's got that nice sound at the front that it's hard to say. Cherub, which is sometimes translated the band, B-A-N. That's the Hebrew concept, but jihad is basically the same thing. One thing Islam does that the Old Testament does not do is it turns jihad into also a spiritual idea. In other words, you can be on holy war against obesity in your own life, or bad habits, or the need to refocus on something. And you're still a jihadist if you're fighting something in a warlike fashion in your own emotional, spiritual, personal life. You don't have to go out and kill somebody. You kill lust in your own heart, or you kill, something else. But the notion of fighting battles, military battles as holy war, the Islamic notion of jihad is basically the same as I just described. I don't know about whether they sound the shofar for sure, but it's the same thing. It's got to be God's enemy. And that's another thing about Islam and about, you can't you're not supposed to say, I hate that guy. I think we're going to go on holy war against him. You don't get to do that, right? You don't get to pick God's enemies and God's battles. That's not, you don't get to do that. By the way, there's an example in the Bible of poor old King Saul. He he just did everything wrong, apparently. Remember I said that he wanted to go on the battle and didn't get a chance on time because Samuel didn't show up. There's another time when he starts declaring new rules. They're on a holy war, and he says, I've decided we're going to fast until we win. There's nothing in the Bible about fasting as being a regulation of the holy war. And there's nothing in the Bible about the king of Israel getting to decide what the rules are. Who decides the rules? God's war. God decides the rules. King, you don't get to go making new ones. And he did, and it turned out disastrously. And Jonathan got in trouble. That was, I think, the third strike. There were 3 things Saul did, and then he lost the kingship, and all 3 of them had to do with holy war regulation. So, have I answered your question pretty well? No, that's not what you wanted to hear. What were you after?
We know now that Saul was the king and Samuel was the priest.
Yes.
Komini doesn't make a distinction there, and how do we know?
Well, yeah, now you're talking about how you stand within, how you standing in one tradition judge another, right? I'm not Muslim and don't want to be and don't think they're right, but there's probably a 58-year-old theologian, Muslim theologian somewhere, saying the same thing about me, right? So, whose holy war is really God's holy war? Ours is, and they say theirs is. Got to be some other grounds for coming together. Now what? What?
No, I just said that's the answer. It's in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah. You have to have other reasons for believing the whole construct, and we have them. So now we stand in this tradition and we're studying it. But I wouldn't start here in trying to bear witness to a non-believer, right? I would inevitably be asked about it, probably, yes.
Well, so part of our conflict is the love thy neighbor
Right.
program.
Right.
And is that in the Quran?
Yes.
Too?
Yeah. There are bad Christians and there are bad Muslims.
And it's in the Quran to respect Christians as
Yes,
well.
it is.
We are people of the book.
People of the book. We are on the Arabic word is an We have a prophet and we have the book. Now, yes, 5 minutes. Yes,
So, how do we know when God is speaking to us about what is a holy war?
Yeah.
Nice sound.
Well, I mean, I would just say this. I have never heard God call me to holy war in my whole life, and I'd be surprised if I ever did. That is a huge question, and the Bible is devoted. Large parts of the Bible, both Testaments, are devoted to this thing. There's the whole question of what is a true or a false prophet, and the Bible has that worked out pretty well, but not entirely. A false prophet doesn't come in the name of the Lord and doesn't stand in the tradition. A false prophet, his prophecy turns out to be manifestly false after the fact. Of course, by the time you've waited around for it to come through or not, it's too late to make your mind up. Jeremiah suggested a true prophet will offer warning. In the New Testament, you have all of these discussions about discerning the Spirit. You have discussions, Paul will talk about people whose gods are their bellies, which I understand to mean people who confuse their own desires for the will of God. Right? Mm-hmm. I told you all about that time I discovered that God loves donuts. Always in favor. God's always in favor of donuts. I'm just the kind of person who argues for skepticism. When I hear some of these preachers standing up and pronouncing that such and so is and God's retribution on this hurricane or that whatever is God's will, I just think to myself, yes.
I understand when God is to do good works, we're called upon to understand them and act. Now, So when God is to defend us, we're not to act.
See, one of the things we have to resist. One of the things we have to resist is the urge, and I've talked about this with you all too, is the urge to absolutize these things. Right? There is a sense in which the first question in the proper interpretation of Scripture. I can find texts that say, "Wait, do nothing," and I can find texts that say, "Get up and get active." Right? In the Bible. Which one's right? And the answer is the one that fits the context. We have prophecy in the Bible still today, which is judgment prophecy. You better straighten up your act. The Babylonians are coming. And we have 2nd Isaiah, comfort ye, my people, speak tenderly unto Jerusalem. Both in the Bible right now. Which text is right? The answer is they were spoken into different situations. And they speak to different situations today. So what I say is that one of the first acts in good biblical interpretation is picking the text that applies to you in order to interpret. So the biggest trouble we get into is by taking a text and saying it's in the Bible, therefore it must apply to me right now. It may not, in fact. And by trying to make it apply, you may be doing just the very, very wrong, opposite of the right thing. The very thing you should not be doing. Right? And these holy war thing, I don't think holy war applies to us at all. It never will. Because we are not ancient Israel, struggling to survive, needing territory. I got 5 acres, that's all I need. I have a hard time keeping it. Right? I don't see God calling us. Who's he going to call? The Presbyterians or the Baptists? Or all Christians? Or God's going to have a little job there. And if he says, if some priest stands in front of us and says, if you're afraid and want to go home, man, my little Ford Ranger will be on the highway right now. Right? Let me say one last thing, because I know time is what it is. I do hope you go home and read chapters, what didn't we get to, 21 and the first several in 22. And realize that even for the collectors of the Deuteronomic Code, this whole business about what is killing and not killing, and what is protecting life, and what is promoting life, and what is holding people accountable for disregarding all of those things that are around the issue, which is complicated in our world, isn't it? Death penalty, gun legislation, it's very complicated in our world. It was already complicated in their world too, right? But the overarching driving principle, I think you will read if you listen to this carefully, is that the commandment against not killing is not about, don't focus on the killing part, focus on the life part. Don't make it a negative, make it a positive, right? It's not just, I didn't kill anybody today. The question is, has life and the promotion and protection of life been important? Is it important in the living of covenant life? And the answer is absolutely. And I'll see you next week, when we deal with much less controversial adultery. Won't that be fun?